Welcome to the Fluids, Electrolytes, and ABGs concept review. These concepts you've studied in your previous nursing courses, so it's really important that you have a good understanding of these concepts so that we can apply these concepts into the situations that we're going to be exploring at this level in nursing school. I've created a series of videos here that are just designed to help you review the content that you should already understand coming into this semester. We are going to be actively working with these concepts throughout the entire semester, so the videos are going to be a good reminder of these essential elements that are very important to each of these concepts. So let's begin with discussing the concepts of fluid first. Specifically, we're going to be discussing the concepts of fluid balance as well as fluid movement, and then we'll end our discussion on fluids by reviewing some IV fluids. It is important to begin with an understanding of why fluid balance is so important to the body. Remember, a large portion of our body weight is actually coming from fluid or water. Approximately 60% of our body weight is considered water. Now, this will vary some throughout our lifespan. So, for example, our younger children and our older adults, they tend to have differences in their fluid volume, which actually is going to predispose them to issues with dehydration. So the picture that you see here goes through the different fluid gains and fluid losses that are going to occur on a daily basis in an average healthy adult. So typically, through the food that we eat and what we take in, your average adult takes in about 2.2 liters each day. As we go through the process of metabolism, that's going to produce 0.3 liters of fluid each day. Now, when we look at water loss, we have some overt water loss, which occurs through the urine as well as through the feces, but we also are going to have some insensible losses. And so my insensible water loss is going to occur through the skin as well as through the lungs when we go through that process of respiration. Now, given that our weight is comprised of mostly water, so again, about 60% or so is water, it's going to be important for you as a nurse to be able to convert between volume and weight. So the standard equivalent that is used for this calculation is that 1 liter of water equates to 1 kilogram of body weight. But as you know, in the United States, most people will report their weight in pounds. So 1 liter of water is going to equate to about 2.2 pounds. And this is an important conversion for you to commit to memory. This is going to be important for you to remember as we address caring for clients with a variety of different health conditions that are actually going to alter their fluid balance. Now, it is important early on that you start making connections with what you're learning so that you can apply it. Application and analysis is really where we are at this level in the nursing program. So let's put this into an application process here. It is pretty likely that sometime throughout your career as a nurse that you're going to care for a patient that has kidney disease and will likely need to have some type of dialysis. We will talk about kidney disease. We're going to talk about dialysis in some of our classes. But in general, dialysis is a procedure in which fluids, as well as some other stuff, other elements, waste products, acid, things like that, are actually going to be removed from the body. Well, if you go and you take a look at the patient's chart and you see that, let's say, 2 liters of fluid were removed during dialysis, then what would this mean to you in terms of a weight change in your patient? Well, this would mean that you would expect that the client would have lost 2 kilograms of weight, or 4.4 pounds. Now, let's take this a step further. What if they took off 4 or 5 liters of fluid? You want to start to think about this as a nurse here. What's going to happen when all of that fluid is removed from a body? Your dialysis runs might be 3.5 hours. What's going to happen if in 3.5 hours we pull off 4 liters of fluid? How much weight has your patient lost in such a short time frame? Take this a step further and think about, what do you think might have happened to your patient's blood pressure when we pull all that fluid off? That's a pretty large volume of fluid. So when I decrease fluid volume, particularly the fluid volume moving through the vasculature, we're going to see that our patient's blood pressure will drop. So you should be thinking, well, one of the things that I need to make sure I monitor as a nurse for this patient is going to be my patient's blood pressure. Now, this is just one example of how understanding the concept of fluid balance is going to be important to your understanding of the other concepts and conditions that we're going to be talking about in this class. Next, let's review a few mechanisms in the body that are responsible for homeostasis. Now, we're going to be focusing on fluids in this section, but we're going to come back to some of these other regulation mechanisms when we talk about some different concepts later on. So when we talk about fluid, the key to understanding how fluid moves in the body is to go back to that concept of homeostasis. Homeostasis really reminds us that there are a lot of kind of checks and balances within our system that are going to help with the movement of fluid throughout the body in order to maintain homeostatic functioning. One really important principle of fluid movement is known as osmosis. So when we're talking about osmosis, this is when water or fluid is going to move through a semi-permeable membrane, and it's going to move from an area that has a low concentration of solutes or particles to an area that has a high concentration of solutes. Now, it's important to remember when we talk about osmosis that we are talking about a semi-permeable membrane. You want to remember that what we're looking at is just the movement of water or fluid through that semi-permeable membrane without moving the solutes themselves. The solutes are actually what is creating this gradient. So as you can see here in the picture, we have a high solute concentration over on this side here. So there's lots of particles, lots of things inside that side. And then on the opposite side here, you can see that we have a low solute concentration. Now what that means is that where my low solute concentration is at, I have a lot more water. The water is going to move where there's a lot more water and fewer particles or solutes to an area where there is less water and a lot more solutes or particles. Now you have to go back to A and P to review how does that concentration gradient occur? What are these solutes that we're talking about that are actually creating this osmotic potential? So we have things such as sodium. We also could have glucose. And we also have protein. These are examples of some of the solutes that exist. And sodium, this one here, has really the highest what we call osmotic potential. So that is the one that has the greatest affinity for water. So sodium is really going to be the one that attracts the water or pulls the water into the other fluid compartment. Now again, let's think about this from a nursing perspective. Clinically, what does this really mean to me? Why, as a nurse, do I need to understand this principle? Well, one of the conditions that we're going to talk about this semester is going to be diabetes. When we talk about patients who have diabetes, they're going to have a high level of sugar in their bloodstream. That sugar is going to be the solute, and that solute is going to be quite high. I'm going to have a higher number of particles that are floating through the bloodstream. Well, that means that this sugar, this solute, is a higher concentration in the blood than what we typically have in the body. And so the way that the body is going to respond to this is it's going to try and regulate this imbalance, this glucose imbalance. It's going to try and regulate it by moving the body fluids through the process of osmosis. Now this high blood glucose level, so the glucose that's in their blood, is actually going to trigger that process of osmosis. So it's going to have the body actually pull fluid from that low particle concentration to an area of high particle or solute concentration. So water is actually going to have to move from my extravascular spaces and move into my vascular space, so into the blood vessel where all the sugar is sitting now. Well, what this does is it actually is going to increase your blood volume. When we increase our blood volume, we alter our blood pressure. Our blood pressure typically will go up. And by increasing our blood volume, we're increasing blood flow that's going to the kidneys as well, which in turn can increase urine output. Now, that concept of increasing urine output, we're going to talk about a little bit later as we talk about filtration. But you can see how this is important for us to understand when we're thinking about the process of osmosis from a clinical perspective. Osmosis and filtration are actually going to work together, particularly at the capillary membrane, to try and maintain the volumes of extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid within the ranges that are desired. So another really important clinical relevance when we think about osmosis is the thirst mechanism. So the thirst mechanism is a great example for how osmosis helps maintain homeostasis in the body. So when we get thirsty, that occurs because very specialized cells within the brain are actually responding to changes in the extracellular fluid osmolarity. These osmoreceptors are very, very sensitive to subtle changes. So if a person starts to lose a lot of fluid from the body, let's say your patient has excessive sweating going on and they're just losing a lot of fluid. Well, what happens is that the overall volume outside of the cells decreases. But because we still have a lot of solutes present, the concentration changes, and we're actually going to see that they have an increased concentration of solute. So what happens is that the cells that are in the thirst center are going to start to shrink because water is moving out of those cells to try and dilute down the extracellular solute concentration. Well, that shrinking of those cells is what actually triggers the thirst center, and that's what makes us thirsty and have this urge to drink. And the goal is to then replace the amount of water that we lost through, our example was sweating in this case, until we get back to our normal osmolarity. Now, it's important to remember, though, that in the older adult population, this is less likely to occur because those osmoreceptors are not quite as sensitive. This is yet another reason why we're so concerned about the older adults' hydration status, because they can become dehydrated very quickly. Let's shift our focus now to talking about filtration. Filtration involves the movement of fluid through a semipermeable membrane due to a pressure gradient. Now, fluid is going to move from the area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. I like to think about filtration as force. It's the pressure that's driving this process here. When we look at filtration that occurs in the capillaries, capillary filtration is occurring because the force of blood is pushing against the walls of the capillaries. So filtration pressure that's occurring in the arterial end, or the artery side, is really going to be dependent upon my arterial blood pressure. Whereas when we talk about filtration pressure in the venules, that's going to be more dependent on your venous blood pressure, which is obviously going to be less than a healthy adult's arterial blood pressure. So as we talk about filtration, I want you to remember filtration is a force. It's that hydrostatic pressure that's occurring. And the hydrostatic pressure that's in the capillary is going to be much higher or greater than the pressure that's in my interstitial spaces. So when we think about that filtration force, which direction is fluid going to move? Well, fluid and the solutes that are contained within that fluid as it moves through this permeable membrane are going to be forced out of the capillary and get into the interstitial spaces, which is a good thing, right? I want all of the stuff that's inside that fluid, the oxygen, nutrients, glucose, things that need to get to the cell, I want them to get into the cell. So it has to move from the capillary into those interstitial spaces and then eventually go into the cell. Now, the problem is that if the pressure inside the capillary is less than the pressure in the interstitial spaces, then what's going to happen are the fluids and the solutes contained within those fluids are going to be forced back into the capillary. So there's another pressure gradient we have to talk about when we look at the process of filtration. We have to consider the process of reabsorption as well. And reabsorption is primarily driven by something known as colloid-oncotic pressure. So reabsorption is a really important process that's going to help us so that we don't lose tons of fluid, to make sure that we're still keeping some of the fluid that we need in the bloodstream. So we don't want all of the fluid that's present to be pushed out of the capillaries. And really, it doesn't matter so much how high that hydrostatic pressure is inside the capillaries. We're never going to be able to push all of that fluid out because the body has a check mechanism in place, which is reabsorption, that pulling force. So it's going to bring fluid back into the capillary. So this colloid-oncotic pressure, that force that pulls things back into the blood vessel, occurs from plasma proteins. And the primary plasma protein, which we'll talk about quite a bit this semester, is going to be albumin. So albumin hangs out within the plasma. It doesn't fit through the openings, so it in general doesn't leak out in a healthy adult. And so we have all this albumin sitting in the blood vessel inside the blood. And that creates this colloid-oncotic pressure, which dictates my osmotic pressure. And that pulls the fluid back into the blood vessel. So in general, what we're going to see is at the arterial side of the capillary, which you can see in this picture here, my arterial side. In general, on that side, my hydrostatic pressure is going to be greater than my colloid-oncotic pressure. But when we get to the venous side, which you can see here, so my venous side of the capillary, we're going to see that the hydrostatic pressure is actually going to be less than the colloid-oncotic pressure. So in other words, capillary filtration in the first half of the vessel, and then when we get to the second half of the vessel, we have reabsorption. So when we think about what is filtration, well, filtration is really just the difference between the hydrostatic pressure and the colloid osmotic or oncotic pressure. Now, that is a lot of just general information. It's great to know, but now you have to think about why, as a nurse, do I really need to understand this? So let's start to think about why all of these different pressures are so important to us as a nurse. What is the clinical significance of this? So let's draw this out so that we can look at this a little bit. So first, on one side, I'm going to draw some arteries. And then another side, I'm going to draw some veins, and then we're going to draw all the capillaries kind of in the center so that you can look at this piece. Now, my artwork leaves much to be desired here, but at least we can see kind of a general overview of what we're looking at. So we've got arteries, we go into the capillary bed, and then we have veins that would come off of that. So we need to think about, from the artery side of things, what is generating the hydrostatic pressure that is going to impact fluid balance. So think about it from the arterial side, what might be responsible for generating that hydrostatic pressure? So hydrostatic pressure has to do with the volume of blood that is pushing against that vascular wall and how much pressure it's putting against that wall. So the heart really plays a big role in controlling how much blood we pump out, so the volume, and then the force behind that. And the end result is blood pressure. So when we think about the clinical significance, or one of the clinical significances associated with filtration, we're really concerned about blood pressure. If we don't have enough of a blood pressure, or we don't have enough blood volume, or we don't have a heart that's working very well, we're not going to be able to generate the hydrostatic pressure when we get to the capillary bed here. Remember, we need to have a higher hydrostatic pressure in those capillaries so that it can push and move fluid out into the tissues so that they can move into the cells in order to ensure that nutrients and oxygen, things like that, are getting into the cells so they can function. So let's make this a clinical significance that you're going to see probably every day of your nursing practice. Let's talk about hypertension or high blood pressure. How does hypertension impact fluid movement? Well, my hydrostatic pressure goes up, and the amount of fluid that pushes into the capillary bed is going to increase. That means that the movement of fluid from that capillary bed into the tissues is going to be greater. So in really simple terms, I'm basically pushing more fluid into my tissues. So if you think about this, if my patient doesn't have a heart that's functioning very well, because remember that heart is really taxed by high blood pressure, and now I have this change in hydrostatic pressure as well because it's so high, we're going to be pushing fluid into the tissues. Well, let's take that to the pulmonary system. If I have a greater pressure occurring in my blood vessels, the pulmonary capillaries, they're going to end up pushing fluid into the alveoli. If I push fluid into the alveoli, my patient is going to develop crackles. So what might we think is going to be a part of our collaborative care for this patient? Well, if they've got a fluid overload state, what I want to do is I want to try and lower that blood pressure. If I lower that blood pressure, that's going to fix the underlying problem, which will then address the shifting in fluid. Now, in a whole nother section of this class period, we're going to be talking about perfusion, and we're going to revisit that concept of perfusion a little bit more in another section. But what I want you to get from this is how does a change in the functioning of the heart, the amount of volume of blood that I have, and the blood pressure, how does all of that work in order to alter our fluid balance within the body? So now let's explore the venous side of things. Remember, we said on the arterial side, hydrostatic pressure is going to be greater. When we come to the venous side, that hydrostatic pressure is going to be lower. But what we have is we have something known as colloid-oncotic pressure. So how do I get all of the fluid back into the vein? Well, we said that we're doing this primarily through plasma proteins, and albumin is the most common and most prominent plasma protein. So as long as I have a patient whose albumin levels and total protein levels look fine, then we're going to see that the fluid is going to return from the interstitial spaces. It's going to come back into the vascular space. And in general, the majority of that fluid should come back there. Now, we're going to see a slight change up in that when we talk about our lymph system, as well as some of the fluid that is used up during our cellular processes. But in general, the majority of it is going to return back into that venous system. But you probably are already thinking right here, well, what happens if my patient does not have sufficient albumin levels? Well, where does albumin come from? Well, albumin is going to be produced by the liver. So let's say you have a patient who has liver failure. We're going to be talking about liver failure this semester as well. What's going to happen to that patient's fluid balance? So pause the video here and see if you can figure that out. Do that application piece. Welcome back. What did you figure out as what might happen when you're caring for that patient with liver failure? Well, a patient with liver failure, they're not going to be able to produce albumin. I'm not going to have sufficient circulating albumin in the bloodstream, which means that I'm going to not have as much of that colloid-oncotic pressure that I had before. So if I'm taking care of a patient and this patient has liver disease, I would expect the fluid to remain in the tissues because there's nothing drawing it back into the blood vessel because the liver can't produce that albumin. So what is my patient going to look like? They're going to have a lot of edema. They could have ascites present. So again, we're going to explore liver disease later on in this class, but understanding how fluid balance works and fluid imbalances occur is going to really help you understand those different disease processes when we get to them later on. We can look at a change in hydrostatic pressure that can cause edema as well. So for example, if you have a patient that has heart failure, typically what we're going to see with heart failure is they can have problems with getting fluid back to the heart as well as with pumping fluid out of the heart. So we end up with this huge increase in volume. We increase our hydrostatic pressure, and that pushes fluid into those interstitial spaces, causing edema. So let us do a quick review of terms before we move into our next little section on fluid. So there are three terms that you probably see quite a bit as you've explored your reading over the past few semesters of nursing school. One term is osmolarity. When we talk about osmolarity, osmolarity is looking at the concentration of solutes in a specific volume of fluid. And usually we're referring to 1 liter, but it's just talking about volume. So if you think about osmolarity, I see, okay, that has an R in it. That's going to remind me that's related to liter, which has an R in it. That's an easy way to help you distinguish osmolarity from osmolality. So when we look at the osmolality, osmolality is looking at the concentration of solutes per mass of the solvent. So this is looking at, instead of it being per liter or per milliliter, osmolality is looking at things per kilogram. So a lot of people really mistake osmolality and osmolarity and interchange them, but they're not really the same thing. Now, obviously, my osmolality is going to be a much more accurate or precise measure, although it's much easier to measure the osmolarity. But you will see that osmolality, serum osmolality we're going to talk about. We're also going to look at urine osmolality throughout the course. And it's important to understand why we look at this measure clinically. And that's because when we talk about water or fluid, that is going to change its volume when temperature changes. But when we talk about mass, mass is going to stay the same. So when we talk about a normal serum osmolality, there's kind of variations in the ranges of normal, but in general, you'll see it somewhere from 285 to 290 milliosmoles per kilogram. One of the things that you'll do at the bedside as a nurse is actually take a look at the estimated osmolality. And this is where we're going to look at serum levels of sodium, glucose, and urea. And that's going to help us get an estimate of osmolality if we need to. And we'll talk about that aspect a little bit more in class. Now, tonicity is a different concept, but similar. Tonicity is when we're talking about the measure of osmotic pressure gradient that is occurring between two solutions. So when we look at osmolarity and osmolality, we're just looking at the concentration of solutes to either a volume of fluid or a mass of fluid. But with tonicity, we're making a comparison, and we use this term a lot clinically. So when we think about osmolarity is looking at all of the solutes. So it's not looking at the ones that can or cannot penetrate the semipermeable membrane. It's looking at everything all together. However, when we talk about tonicity is going to be comparing concentrations, but it's only going to be looking at solutes that cannot cross the semipermeable membrane because we're looking at that concentration when they're not able to cross. This is an important concept because remember, it's the solutes that cannot cross the semipermeable membrane that are going to impact the movement of fluid because they are the ones that are creating that osmotic pressure gradient. Now, this is a really good place to just pause and let's check your understanding of these terms because it's great that you can memorize them. You know the definitions, you know the terms, but in reality, you have to be able to apply this when you're caring for patients. And so if it helps you to memorize these definitions, feel free to do so. But if it doesn't and you just want to start applying this in different scenarios, I want you to pause here and really think about, why do I care about these terms as a nurse? What does it really mean to me? So go ahead and pause the video here and see if you can jot down in your notes some key areas that would be relevant to you that you need to understand these terms for so that you can effectively practice as a nurse. So start to think of some of those reasons and jot those down, and then come back to finish out the last little portion of this video. Welcome back. Hopefully you had at least one of these concepts included in your personal explanation of why the terms are really relevant to nursing practice. Now you may have added some additional information here. These are kind of the 4 main areas we're going to talk about in this concept review, but you're going to see throughout this semester that we're going to add even more relevance to these terms. So let's just do a quick review and make sure that you have a good understanding of the relevance of these terms to nursing practice. Basically, when we're talking about osmolarity and osmolality, we're really just focused on concentration. So what is the number of solutes that are in fluid? So when we start to talk about tonicity, though, with tonicity, we're making a comparison. So as we think about this, you want to kind of compare the amount of solutes in a patient's serum and their plasma level to give us a good understanding of that concept of tonicity within the body. We will also talk about tonicity as it relates to the different types of IV fluids that are used when we're caring for patients who are in need of fluid. When we talk about the IV fluids, we're going to look at their tonicity and relate it to the tonicity or the concentration of fluid within the human body. So the concept is really all about the number of solutes or particles that are in the fluid compared to what's in the human body or what should be in the human body, specifically in the serum and plasma. That's what we measured it at. So when we talk about tonicity, whether we're focusing on the body or we're talking about IV fluids, we're going to use the terms isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic. Let's talk about isotonic first. You can see with isotonic, we really have no change. Now what we mean by that is that the concentration of solutes within the bloodstream is, when we compare that to what we'd expect to find, within the normal range. So we'll start to look at our patient's serum osmolality levels. We'll take a look at the serum sodium level. And as we look at that, we would expect to see in an isotonic state that those would be within normal limits. Now let's think about how things might be a little bit different if we're talking about a patient who is in a hypotonic state, as you can see here. When we talk about a hypotonic state, you want to think hypo as being low. So what that means is there is a lower number of solutes than there is fluid. Or you can think about it as there is more fluid than there are solutes, as we compare that to the patient's body. So if a patient is hypotonic, we're going to see that there is a lot more fluid than there are solutes within the vascular space, so within my patient's serum or plasma. Let's think about an example of how this would be really relevant to you as a nurse. So let's go back to the renal patient that we talked about previously. My patient that's in renal failure, before they go in and have a dialysis procedure done, what type of imbalance or fluid imbalance might they have? Well, if we think about this, your patient that's in renal failure is going to be in a volume overload state. So we're going to see that they have a hypotonic fluid imbalance. Let's add another concept related to fluid balance into this equation. We have a renal patient. My patient with renal disease is going to be retaining fluid. When we retain fluid, our blood volume goes up. With increased blood volume, I'm going to have increased blood pressure. With increased blood pressure, that means at the capillary level, I am increasing hydrostatic pressure. So in addition to your patient being in a hypotonic state, we also are going to see that your patient has a lot of edema because of that fluid being pushed out of the vasculature due to that high hydrostatic pressure. Next, let's take a look at a hypertonic state. So think about what might change in your patient if we have a hypertonic state. When we refer to hypertonicity, this means that we have more solute than we do fluid. So there's a higher concentration of solutes than there are fluid compared to what we normally have. So when we take a look at this, we're going to start to see that the serum osmolality is going to be higher, the serum sodium level is going to be higher, and those terms really go together. Now, before we move into a discussion of IV fluids, let's take a look at these pictures again and talk about what's happening with the cells. When we look at a patient in an isotonic state, we're going to see that we have what we expect as the concentration of fluid to solute. What that means is that we're going to have a net movement of fluid. So fluid is still going to be moving between the cell and the surrounding spaces. However, we're not going to see that there is a change in concentration. Because we don't have a change in the concentration, we're going to see that there is no change in the size of the cell. It stays the same. Remember, an important role or function of fluid within the cell is keeping that cell's shape. Now let's take a look at how that changes when we talk about a hypotonic situation. Remember, when we have a hypotonic situation, that means that we have a low concentration. So we have low solutes in comparison to fluid. So there's a lot of fluid outside the cell. Your body wants to maintain homeostasis, so it wants to try and equalize that out. So what it does is it takes that excess fluid and moves it through the process of osmosis from the area of a low concentration of solutes to inside the cell, which has a higher concentration of solutes. So what we're going to see is that the cell itself is going to swell up because of all that fluid that moved into it. Now, the opposite is true when we talk about a hypertonic state. A hypertonic state means that we have a higher concentration, so there are more solutes than there is fluid. The body is going to try and equalize this out by pulling fluid from inside the cell and bringing that fluid outside the cell. And what that results in is that cell actually shrinking. Now, we use the concept of tonicity to describe IV fluids as well as to describe a condition that a person is experiencing. So when we think about IV fluids, the most important reason that you as a nurse need to understand about tonicity when it comes to IV fluids is to make sure that you are giving the right medication to the right person for the right reason. This is really, really critical when we talk about patient safety. So because it's so important, we're going to spend some time reviewing what is occurring when we administer a hypotonic solution, a hypertonic solution, and an isotonic solution to our patients. So let's start again with looking at isotonic as we talk about IV fluids. So an isotonic solution is going to be a solution that has the same number of particles per fluid compared to what we typically see in the plasma. So you can think about this one as being equal to what is naturally in the body's plasma. When we talk about a hypotonic solution is going to have decreased number of solutes in the solution compared to the fluid, as well as being compared to what we're seeing in the person's body. So a hypotonic solution is going to have a decrease in the amount of solutes in comparison to fluid, and it has a decreased number of solutes in comparison to fluid than what we typically see going through our bloodstream. When we think about a hypertonic solution is going to have more particles or more solute in the solution compared to the fluid, as well as compared to the human body. An easy way to think about this is that an isotonic solution matches the concentration of our serum. A hypotonic solution has a lot more fluid than we typically have in our serum and very few solutes. A hypertonic solution has a lot more solutes than we typically have in our serum and a lot less fluid. So let's talk a little bit more about an isotonic IV solution. A couple examples of an isotonic solution include lactated ringers. You might hear people refer to it as Ringer's lactate. We also have 0.9% normal saline. When we talk about an isotonic solution means it's the same tonicity as what we would see in my patient's natural serum. So if I'm going to give a patient an isotonic fluid, such as I'm going to give them normal saline, the fluid is going to stay within the vascular space. So we're not going to see that it moves into the cell. Remember, with isotonic, we're talking about it being the same. I'm giving a solution that has the same concentration of solutes to fluid as we naturally see in our blood. So because of that, it's going to stay within the vascular spaces. So let's think about this from a clinical perspective. Let's say that you have a patient who has a pretty low blood pressure, and we want to get that blood pressure up. Well, typically what they will give is an isotonic solution, because in order to increase the blood pressure, we need to increase the volume of blood that stays in the blood vessel. So by giving an isotonic solution, it's going to stay within the blood vessel. Now, I also have to consider what else is going on with my patient, though, because isotonic solutions are designed to equate to the same concentration of solutes to fluid as we see typically in the bloodstream. So I also have to take a look at, does my patient have a normal sodium level? What's their sugar level? What's their protein level? Because if those elements are changed, that's going to change how this isotonic solution actually works. D5W is just a little bit different. When we first give it, it is going to be isotonic. However, our body is going to be able to use that sugar pretty quickly, and once I remove that sugar, you think of that sugar as a solute or a particle, then it actually changes the solution to one that is hypotonic. So you have to be kind of careful when you're administering D5W to be aware that only at the beginning, at the initiation of it, when we first give it, is it going to function as an isotonic solution. Let's think about the hypotonic solutions now. Remember, hypotonic means that it's a lower concentration than what I'm going to see in the body. So I have a lower number of solutes than fluid compared to what is naturally moving through the bloodstream. In other words, I've got a lot more fluid compared to particles in the human body. So what I'm going to see is that the fluid, because I've got a lot of fluid in the vascular space and not much particle, that fluid is actually going to now move into the cells. This is a pretty dangerous solution to administer, so you have to be really, really careful because it will quickly leave the vascular space and enter into the body cells. If you have a patient who is dehydrated and they are in a hypertonic state, they can benefit from a hypotonic solution because what we're doing is we're giving them lots of fluid without adding any more particulates, because if they're in a hypertonic state, they already have too many solutes or too many particles. So that's a situation where you might use a hypotonic solution. You need to pay careful attention to your patient's comorbidities as well as the ordered rate of the fluid. When we're talking about giving a hypotonic solution, the fluid is going to quickly leave the vasculature and it's going to go into the surrounding tissues and cells. So think about your patient who has heart failure. If they're getting this type of medication, or even my patient who has renal problems, if they're getting a hypotonic medication, and IV fluids are considered medications, what I'm going to start to see is that that fluid's going to push out of the vasculature and into the tissues, but it ends up dumping into the alveoli as well. So overall, as you start to monitor your patient, you'll start out with your assessment of they've got nice clear lung sounds, and then an hour or two later, if it's been running pretty quickly, I'm going to start to hear crackles that have developed. So pay really close attention when you're checking that right medication to make sure that you know your patient's comorbidities and you're looking at the flow rate. Finally, let's talk about hypertonic solutions. So I think hyper, you want to remember high, meaning that I have a lot more solute than I do fluid in comparison to what we would see in the patient's body, so in our normal vasculature. So if I'm going to give a hypertonic solution, the fluid is going to move out of the cells and into the vascular space because it's trying to dilute out all these excess solutes that we're giving the patient. So let's put this into a clinical situation as well. Let's say that you have a patient that's got just a ton of edema. We need to try and get rid of that fluid, move that fluid around. So what we'll do is we administer a hypertonic solution. It's going to pull the fluid from the tissue and move it into the vascular space. Now I'm increasing the blood volume in the vascular space. It's going to travel to the kidneys, and it's going to facilitate the excretion of that excess fluid. So that's really the most common reason we're going to see a hypertonic solution given. This slide provides just a nice general resource that you can use to help you review the different types of fluids. Now it's important to remember that this is just a resource, and you can see where you can access it at the bottom there. It gives you a general overview, but as you know, our patients never look like our textbooks. So you're going to have to take into consideration all of the different complexities that are going on, all the comorbidities that are present with your patient in order to have a full understanding of how fluids are going to work in your patient. But this is nice as just an overview of the different types of fluid. Let's talk about next steps. So now you've had a good review of the concept. We've talked about fluid. And we're going to continue working with this concept when you come into the classroom as we focus on application. We've talked about a lot of application in here, but you want to pull it all together. So as you come into class, we're going to be talking about what's my patient going to look like when they have a fluid imbalance? What could have caused this? And then what do I have to do about it? What is my role as a nurse? And what's our whole collaborative care for these patients with different changes in their fluid status? So when you come into class, you want to be prepared to apply everything you've learned about this concept into patient care situations. So this concludes our overview of the concept of fluid and fluid movement and fluid balance. The next section is going to focus on electrolyte balance.